Welcome to my ground school course. This course is targeted at people who are taking flight training toward a private pilot or sport pilot in an airplane. The course is intended to cover the information that you'll need to know to pass the knowledge test and to pass the oral portion of the practical test. I've also included more information just because I think it's beneficial to a new pilot to have that information. This course is intended to supplement the instruction that you'll get, both ground instruction and flight instruction, working with a certified flight instructor. My name is Reed Baldwin. I became a pilot when I was in high school, and I didn't decide to follow aviation as my career path, but I've been flying since high school recreationally. Most of the flying that I've been doing has been in tailwheel aircraft. Currently, I fly a Pipistrel Sinus motor glider. So the credentials that I have a private pilot's license with airplane single-engine land and airplane single-engine sea ratings. I have a commercial pilot's license with a glider rating, and I have an advanced ground instructor certificate. In this introductory lesson, I'm going to talk about what you should expect during the process of getting a private pilot or sport pilot license. Then I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of how credentials are handled, pilot certificates, ratings, and endorsements. And then I'm going to talk about the different modules and lessons within this ground school curriculum that I've put together. So what are you and your flight instructor going to be doing that will turn you from a non-pilot into a private pilot? Initially, during your training, you will work on some basic maneuvers like how to control the airplane in straight and level flight, how to turn, how to climb, how to descend. Then you'll start learning standard takeoffs and standard landings, which all lead up to giving you the skills you need for the first big milestone in the process, which is your first solo. Your first solo is a flight just around the traffic pattern of your home airport with your flight instructor on the ground watching. After you've passed that milestone, your flight instructor will start introducing you to some more advanced maneuvers like specialty takeoffs and specialty landings. You'll also be spending a lot of time just getting better at the basic maneuvers. Your instructor will start teaching you about cross-country flying, which means flying from one airport to another airport. Somewhere along this process, you'll need to pass another milestone, which is successfully passing the knowledge test. The knowledge test is a computer-administered multiple choice test. You'll take it at a testing center, and that's where you show that you have a lot of the knowledge items that you need in order to be a private pilot. These things all come together with your practical test. Your practical test will be taken with a designated examiner who will do two things. They'll start with an oral exam where they'll question you on a lot of the things from the knowledge test and some other things from your flight training. And then a practical test where you'll go up with the examiner and you'll demonstrate your ability to do the things that you were taught during your flight training. After your practical test, you'll get your private pilot certificate. And then you'll continue learning long after that. There's a lot more to learn after you get your first certificate. The first pilot certificate that you'll obtain is your student pilot certificate. The only requirements to get a student pilot certificate is to be old enough and to be able to read and write English. Old enough means you have to be within 90 days of your 16th birthday or older. Getting the student pilot certificate is really an administrative process. You and your flight instructor will sit down and use a website called IACRA, enter in some information, and on the basis of that information, the FAA will issue you your student pilot certificate. But the student pilot certificate itself doesn't really give you any kind of privileges. When your instructor feels like you know what you need to know to solo, your instructor will put an endorsement in your logbook, and it's that endorsement that really gives you the privileges to fly the airplane by yourself. Usually the endorsement will have some sort of limitations, like typical ones would be the make and model of airplane that you can fly, maximum wind conditions, things like that. And all of your student solo flights will be under the supervision of a flight instructor. It doesn't need to necessarily be the same flight instructor that gave you the endorsement, but a flight instructor is going to be closely supervising all of your solo flights while you're operating under a student pilot certificate. After you pass your check ride, you will get a private pilot certificate. That allows you to carry passengers, but it doesn't allow you to charge them for flying them someplace. You can ask them to share the expenses with you, but you can't ask them to pay you. You have to be 17 years old to have a private pilot certificate. And you have to have a third-class medical certificate, which means you'll need to make an appointment with an airman's medical examiner and go get a physical to prove that you don't have any disqualifying medical conditions. If you have a medical condition that you're worried might be a problem, then it's good to go after that or talk to the airman's medical examiner ahead of time before you officially do your physical, so that you will not be denied your physical. After you have your first third-class medical certificate, you can use something called the Basic Med program to renew your medical certification for most private pilot privileges. You have to do a flight review every 2 years, which involves flying with a certified flight instructor, at least an hour of ground training and an hour of flight training, and the instructor will verify that you're maintaining your proficiency. You need to have made at least 3 takeoffs and 3 landings in the last 90 days in order to be permitted to carry a passenger. That's really a very minimal amount of current experience requirement. More than that is generally beneficial. There's rules on how much training you have to have had. You have to have had 20 hours of flight instruction, and you have to have had 20 hours of flying solo before you take your practical test. Most people actually take quite a bit longer than that. 50 to 60 hours is more common. There's also a number of requirements regarding cross-country flight experience, flying at night, flying with simulated instruments, etc. You have to have passed the knowledge test, and you have to take a practical test. So pilot certificates past the student pilot certificate have ratings. When you first get your private pilot certificate, it will have 1 rating. For most people, that rating will be airplane, single engine, land. Although there's no rule that it has to be. You can start with other types of aircraft and add airplane later if you wish to. As you fly other type of aircraft, you can get ratings for those type of aircraft. For example, multi-engine rating, single engine seaplane rating, glider rating, helicopters, airships, balloons. Each of these are different ratings associated with a private pilot certificate. For some ratings, you'll have to do an additional knowledge test. For others, you don't. All of these ratings will require you to do an additional practical test. Another type of rating is the instrument rating. In order to fly under instrument flight rules, you have to add an instrument rating to your pilot certificate. That requires an additional knowledge test and an additional practical test. Some types of aircrafts require an additional credential called an endorsement. Some examples here would be tailwheel airplanes, high performance airplanes, which are defined as anything having more than 200 horsepower, complex airplanes, which are airplanes with constant speed propellers and retractable landing gear. So an endorsement is not as difficult to get as a rating. Instead, to get an endorsement, you go to an instructor who gives you the flight training that you need to be able to operate that type of aircraft, and then the flight instructor endorses your logbook. You don't have to do a knowledge test or a practical test with a designated examiner to get an endorsement. So an alternative to getting a private pilot certificate is to get something called a sport pilot certificate. The requirements for obtaining the certificate are less than the private pilot certificate, but you also have fewer privileges, more restrictions. The major restriction is that you are not what type of airplanes you can fly. Currently, you're only allowed to fly airplanes with a weight up to 1,320 pounds. There are not very many of those aircraft available for rent, which is a significant issue for people trying to operate with a sport pilot certificate. There is an ongoing process to change that rule and add a lot of additional airplanes to the types of airplanes that sport pilots are allowed to fly. Assuming that rule goes through as it's currently proposed, the sport pilot certificate will become much more practical. You are allowed to carry a passenger with a sport pilot certificate, but only one passenger at a time, whereas a private pilot certificate does not limit you on the number of passengers. There are additional restrictions on sport pilots, like what types of airspace you can fly in, what altitudes you can fly to. Some of those restrictions are restrictions that you can eliminate by getting some flight instruction and getting an endorsement from an instructor. So you can just kind of get the training for the activities you really want to do, kind of a la carte. One of the benefits of the sport pilot certificate is you do not need to have a medical certificate as long as you've never been denied a medical certificate or had medical certificate revoked. So people who have a disqualifying medical condition, sport pilot may be a good alternative for them. The rules for flight reviews and currency are the same as for private pilots. The number of hours of instruction required is considerably less. You need 15 hours of instruction and 5 hours of solo flying. But the number of things you have to learn isn't all that much less. So the amount of time that people end up taking in practice tends not to be that much less than for private pilot. You do need a knowledge test. It's a slightly different than the private pilot knowledge test, but not a lot different. And you need to take a practical test. The next step up after your private certificate is a commercial pilot certificate. The commercial pilot certificate allows you to charge money for flying the airplane. You have to be 18 years old. The rules for currency are the same as with the private pilot certificate. You need 250 hours of flight time to have a commercial pilot certificate, and there are other additional rules on what has to be included in those 250 hours, like 50 hours of cross-country flying, 10 hours of instrument training, 10 hours of complex. So you obtain most of that experience using your private pilot's license. You take a knowledge test and a practical test, and you don't have to take your instrument rating before getting a commercial certificate, but it's common for people to do an instrument rating before getting their commercial certificate. There are some additional limitations on your commercial certificate if you do not have an instrument rating. I have organized the lessons in this ground school curriculum into 3 separate modules. The first module is an airplane control module, which focuses primarily on how you should manipulate the controls of the airplane in order to make the airplane do as intended. The second module is the airplane systems module, which focuses on how airplanes work and things you need to know about the airplane that you're flying. The third module is the cross-country flying module, which is information you need to know to plan and conduct a flight from one airport to another airport, which may be a long distance away. There are some lessons in the curriculum that don't fit nicely into one of these 3 categories. I put them in whichever one kind of seemed best. I currently have recorded most of the lessons in the airplane control module and a couple lessons each in the airplane systems module and cross-country flying module. I'm continuing to produce these lessons, and I've been producing 1 or 2 a week lately. The lessons within the airplane control module will have a very high degree of relevance when you're learning the basic maneuvers that will lead up to your first solo. I will also cover some material that you'll be learning in your advanced maneuvers, like specialty landings, and some material that you may not learn until after you've taken your practical test and go on to fly other types of airplanes, such as tailwheel airplanes. This chart shows the lessons in the airplane control module. The lessons that are in dotted line boxes have not been published as of November 6, 2024. If you'd like to have these lessons show up in your YouTube feed when I do publish them, then you should subscribe to the YouTube channel. The arrows on this chart indicate where some lessons build on material that was first presented in other lessons. So that should guide you in what order you view the videos in. 2 of the lessons relate to how to use the controls when you are in the air. The first one covers the primary in-flight controls, which are very common across all different aircraft types. The second lesson in that sequence covers secondary in-flight controls, which some aircraft may have, some may not. They're really more directed to optimizing performance rather than all the controls. Another lesson covers how you control an airplane when it's on the ground. So having covered how you control an aircraft on the ground and in flight, then we can talk about the transitions between those two regimes. So there's a lesson on takeoffs, which covers standard takeoffs, specialty takeoffs, and covers both tailwheel landing gear and tricycle landing gear. For landings, I broke those topics into separate lessons. One lesson on standard landings, a second lesson on specialty landings, and a third lesson that's specific to landing with tailwheel landing gear. One lesson which will be forthcoming is a lesson on aeronautical decision making, which is an introduction to that topic, and lessons in some of the other modules will build on that lesson. The second module is the Airplane Systems module, which focuses on how airplanes work. This information is directly relevant to passing your knowledge test. Of course, the reason that it's on the knowledge test is because this is information that is important for pilots to know when they're operating an airplane. So it also will have relevance during your flight training. Within the Airplane Systems module, there are separate lessons on different airplane systems. There's one on instruments. There will be at least one on engines. If that lesson turns out to be too long, I'll figure out how to divide it up into multiple lessons. I'm planning one for fuel systems. Those feed into a lesson about covering the rules for what maintenance must be done and inspections must be done on these systems and who's allowed to do it. There's a lesson on aeronautical decision making relevant to maintenance issues. In another branch of this module, we start with a lesson on aerodynamics, which feeds into the topics of stability and weight and balance, and also feeds into the topic of aircraft performance and the calculations of those performance numbers. The performance lesson will lead into a lesson about aeronautical decision making relevant to performance criteria. Finally, there is a lesson on the use of checklists, which are an important tool for pilots to make sure that they do the things they should be doing to check their airplane system. The third module is the cross-country flying module. As the name implies, this will have a high degree of relevance when you are learning cross-country flying sometime after your first solo. Cross-country knowledge is also heavily tested on the knowledge exam. Weather is always important when you're flying an airplane, but it takes particular importance when you're doing cross-country flying because you may encounter weather in cross-country flying that's substantially different than what you were observing when you left your home airport. So weather will be covered in 3 lessons, one covering weather theory, a second covering the various types of weather reports that are available to pilots, where to get them, how to interpret them, and then a lesson on decision making related to weather issues. Something that's obviously important when you do cross-country flying is how to navigate. So there was a lesson about navigation. There's a lesson about how the National Airspace System is organized, the different types of airspace that exists and what the rules are for operating in them. I'll have 2 lessons on non-towered airports and towered airports respectively. Whichever type of airport you're based at when you do your primary training, you will get very comfortable with how operations are performed at that type of airport. But you may not encounter the opposite type until you start doing cross-country flying. these lessons work together as background for the flight planning that you should do prior to any cross-country flight. Medical factors are important anytime you're flying. I put them in the cross-country flying module because they needed to go in here somewhere. So there will be a lesson on medical factors followed up with a aeronautical decision-making exercise that'll talk about some different scenarios with medical factors you may need to, representative of things you may need to make decisions about during your flying. There's a lesson on airport markings, which get a lot more importance when you go to an airport you're not familiar with. And finally, a lesson on regulations. Now, most of the regulations that you need to know I will be covering in various other lessons when I'm talking about the topic that's being regulated. This regulations lesson is kind of a catch-all for regulations that didn't fit in one of those other lessons, but is something you need to know. Before I wrap up this lesson, I'd like to talk about some materials that I recommend that you obtain as you work towards your practical test. The first is called the Airplane Flying Handbook. This book is produced by the FAA, and it's available in PDF form at the web address on this slide. It's also available in hard copy form from Amazon if you prefer having a hard copy book. I don't necessarily feel like this book is the best book out there on how to fly an airplane, but when you're preparing for an FAA practical exam, it's good to know the FAA's take on how everything should be done. The second reference that you need to have is the current copy of the Aeronautical Information Manual. Like the Airplane Flying Manual, this is available in PDF form from the FAA, or you can get a hard copy from Amazon if you prefer hard copy. This is a reference book, so I don't recommend anybody start reading it on page 1 and try to just read through to page 900 and something. This is for looking things up. So before you do the oral portion of your check ride, you need to be familiar with all of the information you can find in this book and know where in the book to look it up. A lot of people will put a lot of tabs on important pages so that they can quickly get to information they might need if they don't know the answer to something that the examiner asked them. When you reach the end phase of your flight training and you are getting ready for your practical test, you need to get your hands on the Airman Certification Standards. This is the material that your designated examiner is going to be using to know what things he's required to test you on during your practical test, what things he's allowed to test you on, and what standards he should expect in order to determine whether you pass or fail. If you're familiar with this document, then there should be nothing on your practical test which will take you by surprise. My goal with these videos is that they be a good complement to the material that you will be covering with your flight instructor during ground training with your instructor and flight training with your instructor. To that end, I end all of my lessons with a few suggestions about things you should talk to your flight instructor about in order to integrate the material in the video with your flight training. So in this lesson, one thing I'd like you to talk to your flight instructor about is whether your flight instructor has a preference about when you take your knowledge exam. I know there are some flight instructors who really encourage their students to pass the knowledge exam before they even begin flight training. Others make that a requirement before they'll sign them off for solo. Others make it a requirement before they will start working with you on cross-country flying. And other flight instructors, just as long as you've passed it before you go off for the practical test, they're fine with that. Talk to your instructor about what order you should go through the videos in this course. Not every instructor presents things in the same order during their flight training, and we want to make sure that this course dovetails nicely with what they're teaching you in the airplane. Thank you for listening to this first video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the videos in the course.